Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming for what is an extremely important topic, which is the pathways to peace in Syria. It's an honor for me, Jeff Feltman, to be moderating this panel. This is my first time at the Doha Forum. I want to thank our hosts from the state of Qatar and the Doha Forum for the hospitality, for putting together such a rich program. I would imagine that the topic we're going to discuss today, Syria, has come up before in the Doha Forum. But what's important now is that we seem to be entering a new stage in Syria. Of course, in October, there was a conversation between the President of the Turkish Republic and the President of the United States that led to a movement of U.S. troops and the establishment of a security zone in northeast Syria. There's ongoing fighting in Idlib. The UN constitutional process does not seem to have produced the proposals that I think the UN had hoped for. The Astana process, of which the Russian Federation, Turkey, the Islamic Republic of Iran have been involved, continues, but one questions whether the Sochi agreements are being implemented. We really do seem to be at a crossroads, and the question is, if the war in Syria is entering a new stage, or even entering into its final stages, does that mean that there is peace? Is there peace coming? And I think that the question is still very much up in the air on that. And it's a particular honor for me to be moderating a panel with such distinguished speakers who bring such wide experiences and wide perspectives and analysis to the question of paths to peace in Syria. Immediately to my left is Dr. Ibrahim Kalin, the chief counselor to the President of the Turkish Republic, also the presidential spokesman and the Deputy Secretary General of the Turkish presidency. I think Dr. Kalin is very well known for his research and his publications on Islamic philosophy, on relations between Islam and the West, and on Turkish foreign policy. He's also a fellow at the Prince Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Dialogue at Georgetown University. And Dr. Kalin, thank you very, very much for taking time from your busy schedule to join this panel. Next to Dr. Kalin is Dr. Randa Sleem. Dr. Randa Sleem is a senior fellow and the program director for conflict resolution and Track 2 dialogues at the Middle East Institute. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. She's well known for her research on Middle East studies with a particular emphasis on Lebanon, on Iraq, and on Syria, the topic of today. And she has led many Track 2 dialogues and peace-building efforts regarding the Middle East for many years. Dr. Dmitry Furlovsky, next to her, is a Toronto-based policy analyst and consultant who's written extensively on Russia's relations with the GCC and the broader Middle East. He's contributed to the Carnegie Moscow Center, to the European Union Institute for Strategic Studies, and other NGOs. And he provides policy advice, strategic guidance to Russian officials, to private entities working in this part of the world. And finally, Dr. Jason Fritz is a senior research analyst and program manager at the Brookings Institution in the strategic and security team of the foreign policy program at Brookings. His areas of research are state fragility, political violence, and the politics of policing. He's also a lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced Governmental Studies and a senior editor at War on the Rocks. So thank you all for coming, and I see lots of Syria experts in the room as well, so I look forward to an interactive discussion. I'd like to start, Dr. Kalin, with you, if I may. Turkey is one of the three countries in the Astana process, and I think that the strategic outlook of the war in Syria has changed dramatically with the establishment of the security zone in northeast Syria. And I'm wondering, basically, what's next in terms of Turkey's views in Syria? I'm particularly curious about what happens below that M4 highway in northeast Syria. You've established the security zone above the M4 highway. The SDF is still below the M4 highway. Is that what's going to continue, or is there some discussions with the Syrian government, the Russians, about what happens to the rest of northeast Syria? I'm also interested in your perspective on Idlib. Idlib looks particularly difficult from any perspective, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning to you all. Very pleased to be here for this wonderful event and to talk about Syria, which is not that wonderful. Unfortunately, the war has been going on for 8 years now, and as you've said, actually has changed in scope, in character, and the problems that it presents to us. It's becoming a bigger problem. So before addressing your specific questions, I want to put a question to us all, whether after 8 years of fighting, whether we see the Syrian crisis as something that we need to solve, or is it seen by some as a political opportunity to advance other political agenda in the region? Unfortunately, the Syrian file has become a theater for proxy wars, a lot of grandstanding, a lot of political muscling in the region, and that obviously has to come to an end if we are going to have peace in Syria on a larger scale. I think we have to keep this in mind. We have the problem of a failed state right now in Syria, where practically all state institutions other than the Mukhabarat and the Asayish or the security forces, all state institutions have failed, and that is a serious problem, obviously, to run anything in Syria. That has led to the rise of other non-state actors, and unfortunately the US support for PYD-YPG has contributed to this mess by identifying a particular group, the PYD-YPG group in Syria, and arming them in the fight against Daesh. That has also led to some other fault lines in the Syrian file. So we have had the problem of terrorism, Daesh terrorism, obviously, and then the migration crisis, which has become a global issue. So all these issues require, obviously, a lot of coordination. But I think one general principle or fundamental principle for all of us should be the fact that we have to put the Syrian people first before any other national agenda in Syria. I'm talking about all the actors from the US to Russia, from Iran to Turkey, and other countries. The choice for the Syrian people cannot be oppression on the one hand and total chaos and disorder on the other. We have to find another way, produce another solution for the Syrian people to give them a sense of hope for the future. Now, in regards to your specific questions about the safe zone, we have taken an initiative after failing, unfortunately, to do this with the US and other allies, and we've spent at least the last 2-3 years trying to convince our allies, the US, Europeans, and others, to establish the safe zone for the Syrian people, and then we had to take action on our own primarily for two reasons. Number one was to clear our border from the terrorist elements, that is PYD-YPG encroachment, which has gained a lot of momentum over the last year or so. And everybody knows that PYD-YPG is PKK in Syria. I think we should be clear, we should not be deluding ourselves to think otherwise. By calling it SDF, it doesn't make it less PKK. PYD-YPG is still the PKK, and everybody knows that. And secondly, we host about 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Syria, and obviously those who can would like to go back, and we would like to help them. And the refugees will go back to Syria under the UN parameters, that is safe, voluntary, and dignified return of the refugees. As a policy, we have never forced anybody to go back to Syria involuntarily or to go anywhere they didn't come from, and we want to follow the same principle. That's why we began this work with UNHCR. We are in talks with the UN Secretary General as well as with the UNHCR to advance this program. We are doing a very detailed study of who came from where and where they can go back to in Syria. Over the last year or so, about 360,000 people, in fact, have returned to their towns and cities in Jarablus, Azzez, El-Bab, in our Euphrates Shield operation area. Now we have another opportunity between Tel Abyad and Rasulain where the refugees can go back to. But we know the majority of the refugees who came to Turkey, in fact, didn't come from those areas. They came from Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, and other places. So we have to find a solution there. You touched upon Idlib. The situation there remains very critical. Our president had a phone call with President Putin a couple of days ago to talk about this issue, because we see this continued aggression by the regime with Russian Air Force backing towards Idlib. In the name of fighting some of the HTS elements in Idlib, we believe that any kind of military action will be extremely counterproductive. It will lead to another migration flow, and it will put more pressure on us, and then it will put more pressure on the Europeans. So, but the Idlib cannot be solved on its own. It will be part of a larger political settlement in Syria. That's why the political process is extremely important. The work of the Constitutional Committee has to be supported by all. They had 2 meetings. The first one was good. The second one had problems. And we are beginning to see the approach of the regime now to basically undermine the work of the Constitutional Committee. We work very hard to establish this platform and do its work, but now it's been undermined by regimes, all kind of irrational, impossible demands, one of which was, believe it or not, the attempt to list the very people that the regime is negotiating as terrorists in the negotiations. I mean, these are the very people that you're negotiating with, and the regime wants them to be listed as terrorists. So it's basically really a game to either prolong or undermine the work of the Constitutional Committee. Why? Because they know that if the Constitutional Committee produces something binding, something palpable, concrete for the political settlement, they will not be happy with it. In fact, the only way right now, together with the Constitutional Committee, is to work for the completion of the Constitutional Committee and prepare the conditions for elections in Syria over the next 2 years. Probably in 2021, there will be elections. There might be elections, in fact, if we work for it, really. I know the regime has announced already a date for it. We don't have to go by it, but if the Constitutional Committee does its work and produces some binding documents with the support of the international community under the UN umbrella, then we can envisage a situation where the Syrian people, both inside and outside, can go to the ballot box and vote. I know this sounds very difficult, maybe too optimistic or idealistic at this point, but let's be honest. Nobody's interested in regime change anymore. Nobody wants to put enough pressure for the Assad regime to go. The end game here will have to be through the political process. And for that to happen, we have 2 main platforms here. One is the Constitutional Committee. Let it do its work and produce something, either amend the current constitution or write a new constitution. Amending the constitution probably is more realistic at this point. And then go for elections. It may sound strange to even talk about holding free and fair elections in Syria today. That's true. The regime probably will do everything in its capacity to make it not happen. But we have to really work with the international community, with everyone, the UN, the US, Russia, Iran, all of us have to work to make sure that free and fair elections under international observation can be held in Syria, so that the will of the Syrian people can be reflected, and that will become the ultimate binding political decision for the future of Syria, and then we can address the issue of Idlib, safe zone, and other issues. One last point, since Sigmar Gabriel is here also, I want to refer to what he said about the safe zone. He said about a month ago or so in an interview that he reminded us that President Erdogan, in fact, had called for a safe zone almost 3 years ago, in 2015, more than 3 years ago, during the G20 summit in Antalya. The conditions in which, or under which our president made that call had become worse today, 4 years later. And if we had the safe zone at that time, we will probably have saved thousands of lives, but also kept hundreds of thousands of Syrians in Syria and not forced them to become refugees. So I think the relevance and the urgency of the safe zone is clear, but again, we are seeing the failure of the international community to support even this idea. Everybody is talking about not having any more Syrian refugees coming out of Syria or going from Turkey to Europe, but they're not doing anything to address the problem at its core, which is the war in Syria. Without ending the war in Syria and creating conditions in Syria for the Syrians themselves to be able to stay in their country, how are we going to address this issue?
Thanks, Dr. Kalin. I want to come back on some of the Constitutional Committee, but let me turn to our other panelists first for some comments. Dr. Salim, I know personally of the great research that you've done on the whole region, on Lebanon, on Iraq, on Syria, and even further, Iran, et cetera. Right now, with the demonstrations in Lebanon, with the demonstrations in Iraq, is this having an impact on how the Syrian civil war evolves? You know, how do you look at this from your regional perspective? The current developments on Syria.
Thank you, Jeff. And this is my first time in Qatar. And so thank you for the host from the State of Qatar and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussions. If you allow me, Jeff, quickly to contextualize where I see the regime's perspective in Damascus on what's going on in Geneva and what's going on in the whole conflict process, and then talk about the impact of developments in Iraq and Lebanon on Syria. Regarding the former, I mean, there are two ways by which civil wars end. One is a military victory of one side in the conflict. The second is the negotiated settlements between the parties. What we have today in Syria from the regime perspective is a hybrid. It's a negotiation that's taking place within the Constitutional Committee to legitimize a military victory. That's from the regime perspective. And so with all due respect to my colleague here and whose opinion I highly value, Dr. Kalin, I think the regime looks at we should not expect going forward any kind of serious concessions in the Constitutional Committee from the regime, and the behavior of the regime delegation during the second round is basically a sign of things to come. The scenario that the regime feels most comfortable with, at least in the short to medium term, is going to be a no war, no peace scenario. No war in that there will be no major war that can threaten the survival of the regime. That has been already settled by now. But there will be those other wars, the one that you just referred to in Idlib. There is, the northeast. There are a number of forces there. And the regime will continue with the help of the Iranians, with the help of the Russians, to try incrementally to regain hold of these territories, as Bashar al-Assad has announced on numerous occasions. And we have not seen until now Russia or Iran, and both, trying to curb Assad's rushed or interest in regaining these territories. And no peace in respect of the kind of transformative peace that ends a conflict like the civil war in Syria. You are not going to have, at the end of the negotiation in Geneva, if we reach an end, a negotiated power-sharing agreement that brings opposition into the governing structure. Having said that the regime has won a military victory, yet it is a hollow victory. After all, what's left of the Syrian state is nothing but a shell of a state, as you well said, except outside the security sector, the regime has no functional capacities to deliver any services. But this scenario enables the regime to keep the narrative of the ongoing threats to people's security and to the territorial sovereignty, and so keep the people rallied behind the regime, and on the other hand, gives the regime a way out of not delivering on governance issues, because they are in a war and they are not able to deliver on governance. Now, in terms of what's happening, so in addition to that, what we're going to see is a regime that's going, during this scenario of no war, no peace, trying to, under the humanitarian assistance umbrella, to try to use reconstruction funds or any kind of financial assistance to help it reconsolidate the authoritarianism that underpins the regime itself and its hold on power. And so I'm very skeptical about the ability of either Astana, despite the wills of the three participating countries, or of Geneva to lead any kind of serious concession that brings a power-sharing process or a power-sharing government that can bring an end to the war, final end, and that can meet the aspiration of the Syrian people. And I have to say one quick thing. The Syrians went into the street in 2011 and continue, to spill blood in the streets fighting Assad, not because of constitutional amendments. They went into the street because of the lack of security, the role that the security services, security agencies have held over their lives since the days of Hafez and the way he put the regime. And definitely Assad is not going to negotiate away the power of these security agencies. Going back quickly to Lebanon and Iraq. Of course, the three countries are directly and indirectly influenced by each other. And so what happens in one will have impact on the other two. But we have to look at what's happening in Lebanon a little bit differently than what's happening in Iraq. I think what's happening in Lebanon and the impact, let me take a step back. I don't see the protest in Lebanon and Iraq leading to protests in the street of Damascus. This is not going to have that spillover. The people in Damascus are tired, they are weary, they are afraid, and so you are not going to see that kind of spillover. But what we are seeing in the case of Lebanon, the economic and social spillover. During the years of the war, even before that, especially now because the Syrian government and Syria has been shut off from the international banking system because of the sanctions imposed by the West, Lebanon has been the lifeline, for the regime. And due to the economic conditions in Lebanon, recent economic conditions since the start of the October protests, what we are seeing is, including even not only Syrian but Lebanese, people who have money in Lebanese banks, including Syrians, who have been living, middle-class Syrians who have been living of interest on their savings account in Lebanon, not able to access those funds. We have the impact on refugees. For example, I was just in Lebanon, and I was just taking a tour of the southern suburbs of Beirut, where you have a lot of stores that were opened by Syrian refugees. Many of these stores have been shut down. Now, the question, where are these people going with their families? Are they going back to Syria? We have a study that showed that 60% of those who have returned recently to Damascus, to Syria, have returned back to Lebanon because mainly of security consideration in Syria. But where do these people go? Will we see an activation of the Beirut-Cyprus maritime route, for example? Recently, there have been interdiction of some boats carrying Syrian refugees going from Beirut from Tripoli to Cyprus. So that's one impact. The other impact has been on the Syrian pound. Before the 2011 uprising, the Syrian pound was 47 to the dollar. Today, it has crossed the 1,000 mark, and so you have seen a 20 to 30% increase in the price of commodities, in the price of food, but also you have seen foodstuff that used to be brought from Lebanon not also making its way to Syria because it's not coming to Lebanon because of the economic condition. And so that's the impact that's starting to have its ripple effect in Syria. Now, whether this is going to create the kind of fissures, then some government feel that worsening economic conditions can create fissures in the political elites around Bashar al-Assad or in the business elites around Bashar al-Assad. I don't know, we are still early in the crisis. Now, in terms of Iraq, the situation is a bit different there because I think Iraq, especially when it comes to Iran, what's happening there is more of a threat to Iran than what's happening in Lebanon. And partly because until now in Lebanon, Hezbollah, the main Iranian proxy, is pretty much stable and solid in its position. There is no existential threat to its dominant role in Lebanon. Whereas in Iraq, we are seeing Shia who have suspended protests to march in Arba'in, burn Iranian consulate in Najaf and Karbala. That's really a threat to the long-time Iranian project in Iraq. And we have seen pictures of Khamenei being defaced, defaced. We have seen offices of the Iranian-funded Iraqi militias being burned. And you have heard slogans in the streets, Iran out, Iran out. And so I think what's happening in Iraq, especially if it deepens further and it expands more, I think it's going to affect how Iranian policymakers look at Syria. And in my opinion, they're going to be doubling down in their interest in Syria rather than less. And that will be, but also it's going to affect how the US policymakers will think about Northeast Syria. And so going forward, I think developments in Iraq, more than development in Lebanon, will have an impact and need to be followed more closely about how they affect the calculi of the of the actors, the external actors in Syria.
Thank you, Randa. Dr. Farlowski, you're based in Toronto now, but I'd like to ask your views on how the situation in Syria looks from Moscow's perspective. When I was still at the United Nations, we had a serious debate when the Russians approached us and said, please, would you support the Astana process? Because we said, okay, the Geneva process is not exactly going swimmingly, but if we suddenly look to be supporting the Astana process as the UN, does that mean that we're just abandoning what the Security Council told us that we should be doing? So we had a big debate. In fact, Dr. Kalin, the Turks came in very strongly and said we need the UN at Astana. And of course, Staffan de Mistura then did show up for the meetings that were in Astana and tried to contribute to the Astana process. But how does the Astana process look now? Because it seems to me that the Astana process has not produced what it was intended to produce. And I'm wondering, can the Astana process try to support the Constitutional Committee in a more strong way, the way that the Astana process wanted the UN to support its process? How do things look for Moscow and Syria now?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Doha Forum, Qatar Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Brookings Institution for the invitation, and it's a treat to be here. Yeah, I will answer on the Astana framing, but I also would like to say how Russia's relations with Israel, Iran, and Turkey also affect the Syrian context. And I think, so in order to gain a better understanding of what is Russia's position within the region, it's actually very important to contextualize and add some limited structure to the understanding of the relations with these three actors, and as well, in general, trying to decipher what actually Russia's strategy and or the lack of it and goals within the region. So what I would like to start with saying something about Russia, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, and then we'll also comment on what you asked about the Astana process as well. So starting with Israel, if we look at current relations between Russia and Israel, then clearly they could be driven by strong personal connections that exercise on the decision-making process and as well leaders between the two countries. In many ways, they nurture a pretty similar vision of the region. They have no illusions about the future of the Middle East and the current settings there, and continue to believe that the region will continue to remain highly volatile with all of the coming constraints and opportunities for both countries. I would argue is what is interesting about Russia in Israel relations right now is that there has been a breakthrough in understanding of Russia's Israeli foreign policy within Russia. And that breakthrough is actually can be explained that Russia actually views Israeli policy, start viewing Israel foreign policy as independent from the US, which I think is, compared to what we've seen during Soviet times, is quite an improvement. Another important understanding is that Russia also understands that for Israel it is very important to sustain its self-defense, while the visions of Russia and Israel on the region, on their own roles within the region, is quite different. Russia sees Israel as an established power within the region, while Russia is still an emerging power, and while Russia is trying to assert its position, Israel already secured its place. And that's why these interests are not intersecting. At the same time, Russia understands that what's happening right now in Syria and the way Israel perceives Syria is essentially being merged with the Iranian regime and essentially being a part of what's so-called axis of resistance against Israel and the United States, as I think it's called, it was in Tehran. So that's why Israel will not tolerate any threats from Syrian territories. And this is why I think for Russia there's a consensus that there has to maintain very strong and trustworthy continuation with Israel. That's why we probably don't see much of actions from the Russian side when it relates to condemn, except for some official statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when condemning action of Israel. Going to Turkey, we'll see is that relations between Russia and Turkey have been growing, have been improving. Turkey also Russia's fifth largest partner. There is also very strong personal chemistry, one would argue, between Erdogan and Putin. But understanding of how Russia sees Turkey is its understanding is rather complex. And in fact, Russia sees Turkey as more vulnerable than it appears from the outside. Russia understands that Turkey will not accept any more refugees into the country, and likewise would try to remain very cautious in its relations with the White House. Declining political support of the AKP, growing impact of the economic hurdles, presence of 3 more millions of refugees, of threat of ethnic separatism. It means that the situation in Turkey, from the Russia's vision, is quite unstable. At the same time, it is in Turkish strategic interest to establish safe zones, not only in northeast, but also around Idlib, as Russia understands. What we have right now in this 30 kilometers, zone, which has been quite successful, is actually just the beginning. And within Russia, there's a consensus that Erdogan will push further unless there's a safe zone established all across the territory of Syrian Turkey territory border. Clearly, this will also means that what we are going to see in Idlib is that it's a very essential long story that will, and one of the reasons why Russia is not willing to convey any military operation there is because there is a concern about Turkish proxies within Idlib and what kind of repercussions they might have for destabilizing the current situation. And because of Russia understanding this Turkish vulnerability, there are also, and Russia, and also understand Russia's leverages of mostly within the hard power, clearly there are some consensus in Russian establishment that we should both skillfully use the leverage that we have, and at the same time understand that Turkey will not compromise on its key security aspects, and as well, which have a very strong influence on Turkish domestic policies. Another important issue is if you look at what IPG, and surprisingly, I think it's not something that you would hear Russian officials saying publicly, is that there is actually consensus, many some understanding of what is IPG and SDF are as groups. Russia, just like Turkey, understands that despite the Sochi agreements and despite this 30-kilometer zone, the SDF and Kurds, they actually do not, in many ways, do not fall to the obligations that they agreed upon. The situation on the ground also continues to be very tensed in the zones that we see in the northeast. And there is also a threat that Turkey might actually convey another military operation out there at some point. There's another understanding that despite Turkish attempts to remove refugees to Syria, it's clear that Assad will not accept Sunni refugees. And although if they're accepted to Turkey, we might see some retributions against them, which might be carried on an institutional and systematic level. This is, I think, another thing it's important that, as I said, that because Russia understands some of Turkish vulnerabilities, it also understands that its pressure on Turkey and undermine some of its interests within Syria might also trigger a backlash against Russia and a backlash against the President Erdogan within Syria. as Ibn Khaldun once mentioned, geography matters. Russia clearly wants to see Turkey stable at this point, and also wants to deal with the same Turkish administration that right now stays there, which it understands and secures many similarities in terms of vision of Syria. Another actor is Iran, and what is interesting is that because both Russia and Iranian administrations, they arguably see themselves as powers that capable to act as fixers of the region, which to me is quite fascinating in many ways, because is the idea that within the Russian and Iranians, the idea that we see the destabilized regions where our influence might help to bring back order. At the same time, the approaches, Russia, I argue that Russia's power interest approach are much more pragmatic than Iranian. For instance, despite Russia's effective entrance, it has no illusions about the region's problems and volatility, and I would argue try to capitalize as much as power on the soft power that was delivered, the soft power volume that has been delivered by its implementation of Russia's hard power within the country. Iran's foreign policy is much more strategic, and it has more powerful ideological components and actions. And Russia sees that Iran actually has managed to merge itself with the Assad regime, and Syria right now is a part of this so-called axis of states, which were created by Iran to resist against Israel within broader regional Sunni-Shia confrontation. At the same time, what Iran is doing is it's actually trying to promote Khomeini's ideology by converting the local Alawites on the spot, and uses all types of its policies in order to redraw the ethnic map of the country. So clearly what is happening on the territories which are controlled by Iran within Syria is essentially a time bomb. When we see that many Shias are being removed, Sunnis being removed from the certain areas within Syria. And clearly Russia doesn't have any capacity to resolve the issue. It doesn't want to find itself in the midst of sectarian tensions. This is why, despite coordination with Iran, Russia prefers to maintain distinctive areas of control within Syria and do not intersect it to what Iran is doing in certain areas. For instance, we could see that Russia forces are much more are present within Hama, while Iran is in Aleppo, like the 30th division out there of Iranian forces. Concern about sectarian fears in Russia are contributed by the fact that most of Russian military police is actually recruited from the Muslim republics. Like we see that the Russian police, which works in the south part of Syria, in Hama, actually mostly from Chechnya and Ingushetia. At the same time, it was in Russia's understanding that what Iran is doing right now was in Syria, and the way it's imposing the religion and sectarian shades to the Syrian politics is that at some point there's going to be increased levels of backlash against Iranian narrative, not only within Syria, but what I think Dr. Kalin mentioned is what's already happened in Iraq. So basically the supinization of religion with what could be described as a Khomeini's ideology when eventually backlash, and that may create some hurdles for the Iran within Syria. And Russia doesn't want to do with that. So that's why I think what we will see is that Russia's strategic interests lie within Latakia region, which is considered to be the safe harbor within Syria, while in the future I would argue that we will see ultimate Russia withdrawal from the rest of the country and focusing on this specific region. And going straight to Syria, what I would see is that I would argue that Russia's position in Syria is less powerful than it was in 2015. And it directly correlates with how regime in Damascus is currently feeling. If in 2015 there was still discussions that there were still doubts about whether Assad would remain in power or not, right now we would see that the regime is very resilient and would likely stay, and basically there are no alternatives. And there are no alternatives not because there are no alternatives, but because the regime is actually doing everything possible to remove any other candidates from division that could also ultimately lead to any progress in terms of reforming the current Syrian political system. It is also interesting, and what I observed is that within many regions that right now are under control of the regime, Russian forces are actually acting as a buffers against the regime's vindictive policies. For instance, in Dera Kunatra, the territories that right now are controlled within the regime is utilizing very repressive and vindictive policies against those that supported the revolution at the early stages. While the Russian forces that are there, they are viewed by local citizens as essentially those who are protecting them from the regime.
Interesting.
And I found that is a very interesting situation right now, because that also leads to the fact that once the Russians are out and will be mostly focused on Latakia, then we will likely see much more repressions coming to those specific areas.
Dr. Feletsky, let me cut you off there. That's a fascinating point. But given the time constraints, let me at this point move on to Dr. Fritz, because I think that what you've just said leads into some of the research that Dr. Fritz has done. And Jason, I was wondering if you could share very, very quickly, because the time's short, some of the principles that one should look at if one wanted to move from what Randa said, no war, no peace, to what peace would actually look like.
Yeah, well, this is tied, excuse me, very closely to the reconstruction effort and how that might be put together, right? And just to contextualize the reconstruction requirements in Syria, we're talking about half of the housing stock in Syria has been damaged, a quarter of it completely destroyed, half education, medical facilities have been damaged in some way, right? We're talking about $400 to $500 billion in reconstruction needs. Currently, in this year, the Syrian government's entire budget was just over $8 billion, right? So the Syrians aren't going to be able to do this themselves. So the question is who? Well, the Russians, Russia has not shown any willingness to engage in reconstruction, or at least in limited amounts, and Iran has limited capability to do it themselves. So, okay, then who, if it's not them? Damascus and Iran don't want Western assistance on reconstruction, which is going to be problematic because that's where a lot of the money is going to be able to come from. Damascus doesn't want it because they don't want conditions on the aid, and Iran doesn't want it because they want to maintain their influence over Damascus. Russia, on the other hand, does want Western reconstruction assistance, and mostly to legitimate their activities in Syria. However, the US and the EU aren't interested in doing this. The Caesar Act is probably going to be passed into law in the next couple of weeks, which would sanction any entity that does business with the Assad regime. And that's extraterritorial as well, so it's not just sanctions in Syria or in the region, but anywhere that they touch US banks, et cetera. And the US is unlikely to lift any of its sanctions unless there's a change of leadership in Damascus. There is some dissension from within the European community. Italy, Poland, Austria, and Hungary particularly are beginning a discussion of rethinking the EU's position on reconstruction funds, and this is driven mostly by their concerns over refugees. There has been also some discussion of Arab states warming to Damascus and being willing to fund some of the reconstruction, particularly the UAE and Jordan. However, the Caesar Act may actually put an end, or at least cool off that possibility. We can look at the cautionary tale of Qatar's assistance to southern Lebanon in 2006 as an example of issues of non-conditioned Arab money going into reconstruction, where without the conditions, a lot of the funds were siphoned off through corruption, and very little that had any impact on actual reconstruction. So, two major important things to keep in mind in the context of reconstruction and what it might look like for Syria. First is, it's going to be very difficult, sanctions aside, for reconstruction to be effective in recreating the Syrian state while the Assad regime is still in power. Right? It is a government that has not shown any interest in being inclusive, and without an inclusive government and the equal distribution of reconstruction funds, those reconstruction funds will have no effect on creating or fostering peace within Syria. The other aspect to keep in mind is that we are going into a global economic slowdown, if not recession, which means that the typical donor states that may be interested in donating to reconstruction will have fewer funds and less willingness to contribute.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. I don't think we're going to have time to open up for the audience participation. But Dr. Kalin, I would like to turn back to you because unlike the rest of us can look at Syria and try to analyze Syria. You actually have a national security responsibility for Turkey. You play a far different role than the rest of us on this panel do. So I really think that it's appropriate to give you the last word. Given that operational responsibility you have for Turkish national security and your advisory role to the president. So if you'd like to make any comments in closing, and I apologize, there's so many Syria experts in the room, we'd love to hear from you too, there's just not time. But Dr. Kalin.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It is an issue of national security concern to us, obviously, not only because we have a 911-kilometer border with Syria, but the spillover effect of Syrian war has gone beyond Turkey, beyond Lebanon, beyond Iraq, has become a global proxy war. It's affecting global political dynamics in every imaginable way. Put this against the fact that, unfortunately, the international community has largely failed to not only aid the Syrian people, the refugees, but also find a political solution to the problem. That makes it obviously more difficult. For us, more specifically, obviously, we have the PKK issue. And that's not only because we've been fighting against the PKK and its Syria branch, PYD, YPG, but also YPG's arming the YPG undermines and threatens Syria's territorial integrity and political unity, and that goes against the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. And I want to mention this specifically because actually we've forgotten what the UN 2254 says. If you want to go back and read what it says, actually, it does provide some kind of a roadmap. But we've forgotten the issue of the Constitutional Committee, the elections. We had the idea of an interim government. All that has faded away from our agenda, not because they have proven to be impractical, but because the center of attention has shifted, from one thing to another, whether the Trump administration will withdraw from Syria or not, whether the Russians will do X, Y, Z. Well, who is going to control the oil? You see, we are losing the main point, the center of attention in Syria, where the solution can be. Of course, we will continue to fight against terrorist elements in Syria. We fought against Daesh. No need to repeat it here. But the claim that somehow Turkey's latest anti-terrorism fight with this Peace Spring operation weakens or undermines the fight against Daesh is simply not true at all. Factually, when you look at how we fought against our enemies, Daesh, YPG, and others, we have cleared all these areas for the Syrian refugees, the Syrian local people also who were able to go back. Therefore, we will continue this fight. We don't want Daesh to come back in any form or shape. Militarily, ideologically, territorially, but the policies that are being implemented in Syria, through Syria at the moment, I'm afraid will prepare the ground again for the rise of such terrorist elements in one way or another in the short-term period or in the mid-term period. Therefore, we have to find a way to end the fighting in Syria, help the refugees, help with the reconstruction effort in such a way that it is not a gift given to the Assad regime that is responsible for the killing and gassing and the massacre of so many hundreds of thousands of Syrian people, but it's a work that is designed for the Syrian people, not a gift to this Assad regime, and then move forward the political process.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalin, Dr. Salim, Dr. Filofsky, Dr. Fritz. Each of you said things that I think deserve an entire seminar themselves that we just don't have the time to follow up on today. So if the participants in the hall could join me in thanking our panelists today. And I look forward to lots of conversations on the margins of the Doha Forum, picking up on some of the things that you've said today. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.